So back in November, as we were planning Advent and Christmas, I asked Colin what his thoughts were about a possible sermon series for these weeks between Epiphany and Lent. And he suggested that we look again at what it means to be a United Methodist, or actually more specifically, at our Wesleyan heritage. That theological DNA, if you will, we've inherited from John Wesley, who was the founder of the 18th century Methodist movement in England that eventually gave birth to the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States, which is one of the predecessors of our current United Methodist Church. And I want to say that while the shape of our denomination going forward is more than a bit up in the air right now, as we await the decisions and the actions of the special called General Conference in 2019, one thing I think we can say with certainty, as a church, at least as this church, we continue to be those who are informed and shaped by that great theological heritage we've received from John Wesley and those who came after him. So for the next weeks, we're going to revisit some of the things we believe as Christians in this Wesleyan tradition. And we're going to begin today with our understanding of baptism. Last week was actually Baptism of the Lord Sunday in the liturgical or the Christian year. But since it was also the first Sunday of Epiphany and Communion Sunday, both of which I love very much, I pushed it forward a week so that we could focus on both Epiphany and Communion and then Baptism of the Lord today. I didn't want to shortchange either, but tried to cram them all into one service. So baptism. Baptism is one of those theological places where Christians sometimes disagree. There's some disagreement over how we should be baptized. Should we sprinkle or pour? Or do we have to be baptized by immersion? Now, I'll tell you that as United Methodists, we recognize the validity of all three means of baptism. We typically tend to baptize by sprinkling, but I've actually done an immersion baptism. And that's available to anyone who wants it. We just have to go find a place with a baptismal font or a big group of body of water to do it. But anyway, we recognize all the validity of all the means of baptism, and we are open to doing baptism by any of those means. But there are also differing beliefs about how old the person who's being baptized has to be. In other words, do we do the baptism of infants and children, or does a person have to be at an age where they can profess Christ for themselves? And that's a real sticking point for a lot of Christians. Until I was 13, I was a part of a theological tradition in which only professing believers could be baptized, and then only by immersion. So when I became a United Methodist, infant baptism was a bit foreign to me. And to be honest, my understanding of why we baptize infants was a work in progress for many years. So if you're still struggling with that, that's okay. Because it takes a while to really get your head around it if you weren't raised in a tradition where that was a part of who you were. So that, and there's different ways, and I don't want to say that there's a right way and a wrong way. This is our way. And you don't have to agree with that to be a part of us. So, but I'm going to talk to you about what our understanding as Wesleyan Christians, as Methodists in baptism is. And I'll say that once I begin to understand baptism from the point of view as baptism being not what we do, but not about our response, but instead about what God is already doing in our lives, in us, then infant baptism began to make perfect sense for me. You see, we believe that in baptism, God is the primary actor, not us. And if you can begin to understand that, if you believe that, then it really doesn't matter if it was your parents who decided to have you baptized as an infant or a small child, or something you decided for yourself. Because it's not dependent on what we do. It's about God. Look again at this morning's passage from Mark, verse 9 through 11. About that time, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and John baptized him in the Jordan River. While he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw heaven splitting open and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him. And there was a voice from heaven saying, "You are my Son whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness." Think about that passage for a moment. In that passage, who is the primary actor? God, through the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not Jesus. In fact, Jesus is actually fairly passive. He goes and he presents himself to John, his cousin, to be baptized, but it is God who does the talking. It is God who comes down like a spirit, the Holy Spirit like a dove. It is God who is the primary actor in this rite of baptism. It is God that is doing something. Jesus doesn't say anything. David Lose, like I said, points out that he's actually rather passive in all that happens. And Lose suggests that that's the way it should be. Because this particular passage, this particular event in the life of Jesus marks the beginning of his public ministry. It's the start of his long and difficult journey toward Jerusalem and eventually the cross. So it kind of makes sense, if you look at it from that perspective, that at his baptism, Jesus doesn't have to do anything, but rather simply receives the gift of God's Holy Spirit, receives that assurance of his identity as a child of God, a child who is highly favored, with whom God finds much happiness. It is at his baptism that Jesus receives these powerful words of acceptance and blessing and identity and commitment. You are my Son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness. Jesus' baptism, and this is the key point, I think. Jesus' baptism is about who he is and, more importantly, whose he is. It's about his identity. In this passage, Jesus hears that he is accepted, he hears that he is much loved, and he hears that he brings happiness to the heart of God. In unequivocal terms, God makes known Jesus' identity as this much loved child of God. And that's powerful. It's powerful, I think, not only in that moment that it happened, but I think it retains its power throughout the entirety of Jesus' ministry. And I think that's the gift of baptism, the gift of God's grace. We don't have to do anything, do we, to receive God's grace. In fact, the beauty of infant baptism is that you can't do anything, and it points that out. Not even make a decision for Jesus, let alone commit your life to it. We baptize infants because we don't have to do anything. It's about what God is already doing in our lives. Baptism is a recognition of God's claim on us, of that identity that God has already given us as a child of God, as the song said. We are called God's beloved children, not because of anything we do, but because of who God is. God is a loving parent who wants nothing more than to see us flourish. In baptism, God chooses us. In baptism, God says we're enough already, that we are pleasing to God and that we deserve God's love. Not because of who we are, but because of who God is. And that identity of being God's beloved child, precisely because it comes from God, cannot be taken away from us, for that matter, or it can't be lost by us. But God continues to come into our lives to call us beloved and blessed, and to promise again and again to always be with us and for us. That's the promise and the blessing of baptism. And that in turn helps us face all the challenges we encounter in our daily lives. Just as it helped Jesus in the trials he would encounter on his way to and in Jerusalem. because we know that our identity is in God, that we are beloved children of God who are much loved, much loved. We can face whatever challenge life presents with greater confidence. Now, having said that it's solely a gift, fully a gift. It's a recognition of God's love in our lives at work in us and God's grace. That doesn't mean that we just passively receive that gift and don't do anything with it, does it? That's just the beginning, really. Our baptism is the beginning. Yes, we are much loved children of God. But guess what? So is everyone else in this world. And that includes people from Africa, in Haiti, in El Salvador, in Mexico, and all those other places that some people deem as unacceptable. And yes, while we are in some sense passive recipients of God's grace and that identity that we're given, we are very much called to be active participants in sharing that grace with others all around the world and in working to make sure that all God's children are treated as the children of God they are. All God's children, not just those who look like us. All God's children should be treated as the much loved children of God. After a while, we're going to do the Remember Our Baptism covenant. But when you're baptized in the Methodist Church, there's a question that you're asked. Or when you bring a child to present a child for baptism, there's a question that's asked. And it said, will you let the Spirit use you as a prophet to the powers that be? And the response is, we accept the freedom and power God gives us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. We accept the freedom and power God gives us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Tomorrow, our nation celebrates the birthday and the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a servant of Christ who dedicated his life to fight against evil, injustice, and oppression, especially as it affected people of color in this country. We are 50 years almost past his assassination, and we still have far, far, far to come. And as Christians, as those who have claimed our identity as children of God, it is upon us, it is incumbent upon us, that we take seriously our responsibility to work to overcome that oppression and injustice and the evil of racism Amen. In our world. I think it ironic that the President's remarks come on the eve of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday reminds us of the better people we are called to be. And I think this is a good climate. Given the climate in our nation, I think this is a good time to reflect on our responsibilities as a community of faith and as people of God to continue the fight, to see that all God's children are treated as children of God. In a few minutes, we will be reaffirming the covenant made at our baptisms, either by us or by those who brought us to be baptized. As United Methodists, we don't believe in rebaptizing because, again, we believe that it is God that is working in the baptism and not us. So it doesn't matter if we were baptized in infants and have no memory of it. What happened in our baptism was about what God was doing, and we don't have to remember. We didn't have to know. So we don't rebaptize. That's just a part of our doctrine of the United Methodist Church. But if you choose to participate, you will have an opportunity today to come forward and dip your hand into the baptismal bowl. And as you let the waters run through your fingers, I invite you to think about your own baptism, whether you can remember it or not, and be thankful for that identity that it represents. The fact that you have been claimed by God as a much-loved child of God with whom God is happy. For this is a day to remember and a day to be thankful for the gift of love and grace of God that God has given each of us.